The high country of Colorado, in September of 1888, wore two faces at once, the way a man caught between confession and lie sometimes does. By day, the aspens along the eastern ridges turned the color of old brass, and the light came down through them the way light comes through the windows of a church that has forgotten who built it. By night, the thermometer on the porch of the Ironbell General Store dropped a finger at a time, and, by the small hours, the frost climbed the inside of every window in town like ivy that had learned patience. Men stepped out of their cabins in the morning and blew into their hands and told each other the old lie that this winter would be no worse than the last, while in their bones they already knew that it would be the winter their grandfathers had warned them about. The high country does not bluff. It sharpens itself quietly out of sight, and then it shows you the edge. Ironbell itself was not large. 300 souls a silver mine, whose best veins had begun to thin a lumber mill at the south end of the valley, whose saw could be heard from a mile off a steepled church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a general store that doubled as a post office, and a cluster of cabins arranged along the creek with the logic of people who had come at different times and made their peace with the ground they were given. The men of Ironbell measured the worth of a neighbor by two plain things: the height of the cordwood stacked against his cabin wall, and the thickness of the smoke that lifted from his chimney in the first gray hour after dawn. A man with a tall wood pile had thought ahead. A man with a thick plume of smoke was burning dry, seasoned timber, not green, which meant he had started cutting in the spring rather than in the panic of October. These were not opinions. These were the grammar by which the town read its own survival. And in that grammar, a widow who did neither was not yet a tragedy. She was only a question that the town had not yet found a polite way to ask. Clara Vance did not have a woodpile. She had something the town considered more dangerous. She had the books of a dead man that no one in Ironbell could read, and she had a quiet she did not try to fill, and she had two children who looked at her the way children look at a mother who is still deciding whether to tell them the truth. The town had arrived at its judgment of her without ever holding a meeting. It had been reached in the careful sympathy of women passing each other at the counter of the store, and in the long pauses between words when her name came up at the end of Sunday service, and in the tight, bright courtesy the mill hands offered her when she walked past them with a basket on her arm. Pity in Ironbell was not unkind. Pity was a blanket that the town laid down first, and then, when the blanket was not enough, the town began to speak of what else might be done. A widow with two small children, a cabin that had been built for summer, a husband 3 months in the ground, and a stack of leather journals no one had read since the burial. The math was not difficult. Everyone in Ironbell knew how to add, and everyone in Ironbell had already added. She was 34 years old. She had come into the valley 12 years earlier on the seat of a hired wagon beside a man named Edmund Vance, a tall, lean geologist with a crooked smile and a habit of stopping every 2 miles to pick up a stone and turn it over in his palm and mutter to himself. She had loved him then, and she had loved him still when the ground took him in April, when a cut bank above a prospect trench had given way after 3 days of spring rain and carried him down in a hush so brief that the man working beside him had not had time to shout his name. She had buried him on a bright morning, with the last snow still lying in the shaded hollows. She had walked home alone afterward, past the mill and the store and the houses with their doors politely closed, and she had sat at the table in her kitchen, and she had not wept. That was the first thing the town had noted about her, and misread. She had not wept where anyone could see, and so the town, needing a story, had written her as a woman who had not understood what had happened. They were not cruel. They were only wrong. Her children Eli and May were 8 and 6. Eli had his father's long wrists, and his father's way of studying a thing with his head tilted, as if he were trying to hear it as much as see it. May had the broader face of her mother's family, and a laugh that came out of her, without warning, at odd hours, in the middle of chores, as though some private joke ran inside her that she had not yet decided to share. They had wept in April. They had wept in May. By September, they had stopped weeping and had begun instead to watch their mother with a steady, sidelong attention that Clara felt all day like a pair of small hands resting on her back. The cabin in which the three of them lived had been built by Edmund himself in the summer of their 3rd year in the valley, and it was as the mill foreman had put it one evening over a cup of coffee at the store. A cabin that had been designed by a man more interested in the secrets of a rock than in the common sense of a roof. The logs had been cut from the stand of lodge pole at the north edge of the plot, and they had been laid with care, but the chinking between them had been mixed wrong with too little clay and too much sand. And in the 2 years since the cabin had been raised, the chinking had shrunk and cracked along nearly every seam. The foundation was a handsome ring of local granite dry laid, which Edmund had admired for its honesty, and which Clara now understood too late was drawing the warmth of any fire straight down into the cold bedrock beneath them. The roof was a simple plank affair of boards and tar paper, already sagging a finger's width along the south-facing slope. And when the wind came up from the creek at night, it found the gaps around the eaves and whispered through the loft like something telling a secret it had been waiting to tell. The cabin was not a home. It was a structure that had forgotten. It needed to become one, and the forgetting had gone on too long. She sat at the kitchen table on the evening of the 12th of September, with the last of the lamp oil burning low and the pot on the stove boiling dry, and she did not stand to take it off. She was reading. She had been reading for 3 nights running, and she had come at last to the back of the last of Edmund's journals, the one bound in dark Cordovan leather, with a small brass clasp that he had kept on the shelf above their bed. She had opened every other journal before this one, and had understood almost nothing. She had not been a student of his work. She had been his wife, which is a different kind of student, and what she had learned from him over 12 years had come in at the edges through the side door in the careless way a man talks when he is happy. She had heard him in the summer of their 5th year describe with quiet enthusiasm the stone hearths the first settlers of Pennsylvania had built. Massive slabs of fieldstone that drew a fire sideways and held its heat for a day and a half after the last coal had gone gray. She had heard him on a wagon ride back from a prospect in the San Juans describe a root cellar an old Maine farmer had dug into the side of a hill, how the potatoes had kept all winter, and the cellar itself had never dropped below 45 degrees, even when the air outside had fallen to 30 below. She had heard him speak more than once of a man named Benjamin Thompson, who in 1796 had published a small treatise on the proper design of a fireplace, an American living in London at the time, who had understood before anyone else in the English-speaking world had put it into print that a fire was not a performance but a problem, and that the problem could be solved by geometry. She had heard these things the way one hears music through a wall, knowing that there is a room somewhere with a piano in it, but not needing in that moment to find the door. The door was in her hand now. Folded into the rear pocket of the Cordovan journal was a square of paper she had never seen him unfold, and when she unfolded it, she saw their plot of land rendered in his careful draftsman's hand. The creek, the stand of aspen, the granite outcropping that made the northern boundary. The cabin itself as a neat small rectangle with the door properly placed and behind the cabin. Perhaps 60 yards up the slope of the hillside, a small shaded notation in the shape of a wedge. Beside the wedge, in his precise lettering, were 4 words and a number. Karst Formation. Stable limestone. 55. Beneath the number on the lower margin of the page, he had written a single line in a hand slightly larger than his usual, as though the line had been added at a different time and with a different feeling. The earth does not forget the sun. She sat with the map open in front of her until the lamp oil gave out and the kitchen went dark. She did not relight the lamp. She sat in the dark and listened to her children breathing in the loft above her, and listened to the wind finding the gaps in the chinking, and, for the first time since April, she allowed herself to understand a thing she had been refusing to understand, which was that her husband had not left her empty-handed. He had left her a door and the word for a door, and he had not lived long enough to say aloud that the door was there. She folded the map once carefully along the creases he had made, and she put it back into the pocket of the journal, and she put the journal back on the shelf above the bed, and she went to sleep with her hand resting against the cold log of the wall, as though the wall itself might know what to do next. In the morning, the sky had gone a thin milk blue, the kind of blue that in Colorado is a warning rather than a promise, and there was a rime of frost on the handle of the axe where it leaned against the woodshed. She heated water on the stove and washed the children's faces and sent Eli out to feed the 2 hens and the goat, and then she stood at the kitchen window and looked up the slope behind the cabin at the tangle of thorn and fallen scree that marked the place where, if the map was true, there was a door. She had walked past that slope every morning for 9 years, and had never seen the door because she had not known to look, and because the thorn had grown over it, the way thorn grows over anything that has not been asked for in a long time. She put on her husband's old canvas coat, which still smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco he had favored, and she took up the pickaxe and the short-handled shovel, and she climbed. The work of that first morning broke her hands open. The thorn was old and meshed, the kind that bends, rather than breaks, under a blade, and she learned after the first hour to cut at the roots, rather than the crowns. The scree hid larger stones beneath it, and twice she set a rock rolling that nearly took her ankle. By mid-morning, she had cleared a rough oval of ground about the size of a wagon bed, and, at the center of that oval, behind a last screen of brittle stems, she found it. It was not grand. It was a cleft in the hillside, perhaps 3 feet wide at its mouth, angled back into the rock, breathing out into her face a cool, still air that smelled of wet stone and thyme. She felt the breath on her cheek, and she understood, without needing to reason it through, that this was a different air than the air behind her. This was air that had not been cold in the way the morning was cold. This was air that had been kept. She worked another hour to widen the mouth enough to slip through. May came up the slope with a tin cup of water and stood at the edge of the cleared ground with her eyes very wide, not saying anything, and Clara drank the water and touched her daughter's cheek with the back of her wrist and sent her back down. Eli came up after, and Eli did not go back down. He stood at the mouth of the opening, and he looked into the dark, and he did not speak, and then he said in a voice that was small and steady, both a voice Clara had never heard from him before. "What is it, Mama?" And Clara, who had not yet gone inside, said the only true thing she could think to say. "It's a place your father left for us." She went in with the lantern. The cavern opened up past the cleft like a held breath released, and she stood upright inside it and swung the lantern in a slow arc and saw what it was. Not large, perhaps 20 feet deep, 12 wide, the ceiling low at the entrance and rising toward the back to something she could stand beneath without stooping. The walls were the pale cream of limestone that had been bedded down when the whole of the Rockies had been a shallow inland sea 100 million years before any man had come to the valley to argue about the price of lumber. She put her bare palm flat against the wall, and the wall was not warm and was not cold. And when she pulled her hand away, she could feel the difference between her palm and the rest of her skin, and the difference told her everything. Edmund had been right. Edmund had been right, and he had not lived to tell her. She stood in the dark with her hand still tingling, and she said aloud into the still air of the cave the word that was also a promise and also a question. All right. That evening, with the children asleep, she took down the Cordovan journal and she read it again slowly from the beginning. She read with a different attention now, the attention of a woman who had something to do and did not yet know how to do it. She read his long digressions on the way. A fieldstone fireplace soaked up heat from a pine fire and released it into the room over the course of a night and a morning. She read his admiring notes on Benjamin Thompson's 1796 design, the narrow throat, the angled rear wall, the shallow firebox, the smoke shelf. She read his 2 careful pages on the Maine farmer's root cellar, the way the earth above it had acted as what he called a thermal battery. A phrase she turned over in her mind and did not yet understand, but began to trust. She read the equations she could not follow, and she did not try to follow them. She understood that she was not going to become, in the weeks she had the kind of woman who could follow his equations. She was going to become, instead, the kind of woman who could find in his pages what she needed and leave the rest for another life. She read until the lamp oil ran low again, and then she put the journal down, and she began on the back of a used envelope to make a list of things she would need. The list was short. It was honest. It was the first honest thing she had written since April. Harlon Croft came up the wagon track to her cabin on the 3rd morning after she had opened the cave, and he came without warning and without apology, because that was the way he came everywhere in Ironbell. He was 52 years old, broad through the shoulders, slow in his movements, the way large animals are slow, with a beard trimmed close along the jaw, and a pair of pale gray eyes that had been made for looking hard at structural problems and had looked at little else for 30 years. He owned the lumber mill at the south end of town. He had raised the roof beams of the church with his own hands in the summer of 1874. He had organized the bucket brigade that had saved the assay office in the fire of 1881. He had driven a load of cordwood up to the Peterson place in the February blizzard of 1886 without being asked and without being paid, and he had never mentioned the errand afterward, not once, not even to his wife, because a thing a man does for a neighbor is not a thing he is permitted to spend twice. He was not a cruel man. He was something more difficult. He was a certain man. His certainty had been built by 30 winters of being right about lumber and roofs and stoves, and his certainty had kept men alive, and the town had given him in return the quiet authority that such a man is given in a small place, which is the authority to walk up a wagon track without warning and to speak to a widow about her cabin without having been invited. He walked the perimeter first. Clara watched him from the kitchen window with her arms folded across her chest and did not go out to meet him. He moved the way a doctor moves around a patient. He knocked his knuckles against the logs in 3 places along the north wall, and listened to the sound and nodded once, not in approval. He crouched at the southeast corner of the foundation and ran his fingers along the dry laid stone and did not nod at all. He stepped back 10 paces and looked up at the roof line and tipped his head the way Eli tipped his head, and Clara felt unfairly a small flash of resentment at the resemblance. Then he came to the door and he knocked, and she opened the door, and he took his hat off and he said what he had come to say, which was not cruel and was not wrong, and was in the end the only thing a man like Harlon Croft knew how to say to a woman in her situation. Mrs. Vance, his voice was even pitched low for the small room. I'm not going to pretend with you. The chinking on this cabin is going to be on the ground before Thanksgiving. The foundation is pulling heat straight down into the bedrock, the way a wick pulls oil. The roof has already started to go on the south slope, and when the first real snow loads, it's going to go the rest of the way. I can put 3 of my men up here tomorrow and have the roof braced by sundown. I can sell you an Iron Duke stove at half the shelf price and carry the note for you over 3 years. I can have seasoned fir cord wood delivered by the cord through December. I am not offering these things to be kind. I am offering them because if I do not offer them, those 2 children are going to be cold in a way that children should not be cold, and the responsibility for that will sit with this town, and I do not intend to carry it. He stopped and he waited. He had said what he came to say. He had said it plainly, as a man says a thing he has said 100 times before to 100 other people, all of whom had eventually, with relief, said yes. He was not prepared for what came next, because in 30 years of offering the same offer, no one had ever not said yes. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was aware as she looked that what she was about to do would cost her. She was aware that a door was going to close when she spoke, and that once it closed, she would not be able to reopen it simply by changing her mind, because Harlon Croft was not a man who reopened doors for people who had closed them on him. She looked at him anyway, and she said the things she had decided in the dark of the cave 3 mornings before that she would say to the first person who offered to save her. Mr. Croft, I am grateful to you. Truly. I want you to hear that first, because what I say next is going to sound ungrateful, and it is not. She drew in a breath. Have you ever stood in a room heated by an iron duke and felt the floor be as warm as the air? He blinked at her. It was not the response he had come prepared to receive. It took him a full second to sort the question, and when he did, his eyebrows drew together, not with anger, with a kind of professional puzzlement. Mrs. Vance, a stove is not meant to heat a floor. A stove is meant to heat a room. I know that is what it is meant to do, she said. Her voice was very quiet. I am asking whether it does. He stood in her doorway, and he did not answer the question because the honest answer was no. And he had never been asked the question before, and he did not yet have a language in which to say no without admitting something he had spent 30 years not admitting. He put his hat back on and he said, as a man says, when he is ending a conversation that has taken a turn he did not plan, I will leave the offer standing for a week. You think on it, Mrs. Vance. You think on it hard. A woman in your circumstance does not have the luxury of thinking on it twice. And he turned and he went down the wagon track, and Clara closed the door and leaned her forehead against the inside of it for a count of 10 before she turned back into the kitchen. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of a Croft, and she was not going to start. The next morning, she went back up to the cave with the pickaxe and a bucket, and she began the work of clearing the floor, and she worked straight through that day and the next and the next. And on the 4th day, when she was carrying a load of broken scree down in the bucket and had stopped at the wagon track to catch her breath, She looked up and saw that a woman she did not know was standing at the edge of the cleared ground with a small canvas sack at her feet watching her. The woman was perhaps 60, a little stooped, gray, braided at the back, a plain cotton dress under a man's wool coat, several sizes too large for her. Claire had seen her once or twice at the back of the general store, paying in coin and leaving without speaking to anyone. Nora Webb, who lived in the last cabin at the east end of Ironbell, where the road gave out and became a trail into the timber. A widow of the mine collapse of 1879. A woman who kept hens and sold eggs and did not go to church and was not spoken to unkindly and was not spoken to much at all. You need another set of hands on that slab, Nora said. It was not a question. Her voice was dry, almost bored, the voice of a person who had watched the world fail to do obvious things for a long time and had stopped being surprised by it. She walked past Clara up to the mouth of the cave, and she looked in and she said without turning around, "Your husband was a smart man." And Clara, who had not yet heard any person in Ironbell say anything about Edmund that was not a form of condolence, felt something that had been held tight in her chest for 5 months unclench a quarter inch. They worked together that afternoon without talking. Nora did not ask what Clara was building, and Clara did not explain. They moved 4 stones that Clara could not have moved alone. And when the sun began to fall behind the western ridge, Nora stood up from the last stone and brushed her palms on her coat, and picked up her canvas sack and said, as she started back down the slope, "I'll be back Tuesday." And she was. On the second visit, after they had worked through the morning, Nora sat on a stump near the mouth of the cave and drank cold water from a tin and looked sideways at the rough stone and clay bench Clara had begun to shape along the inside of the cavern, the long curved spine of it running from the rear wall toward the entrance. Nora considered it for a while, and then she said in the same dry bored voice, "Light earth holds a fire one night. Heavy earth holds it 3. You want heavy." Clara set down the pick she had been sharpening, and she looked at Nora for a long moment, and Nora did not look back. And Clara understood that she had just been given without ceremony a piece of knowledge older than the journals on her shelf and identical in substance to the equations in them. She nodded. Nora nodded. Neither of them spoke of it again. She made her first fire on the evening of the 29th of September, and it failed. She had built the firebox in what she had thought was the right shape. A small wedge at the back of the bench, with a narrow throat rising above it, and she had laid a little pyramid of pine shavings and small splits, and she had struck a match and held it to the tinder, and watched the flame catch. For perhaps 30 seconds the fire behaved. Then the draft reversed, whether because the exit flue was too short, or because the cold air standing in the bench was heavier than the warm air trying to rise through it. She did not yet know. And the cave filled with thick pale smoke, and Eli, who had been standing at the mouth of the cave with his small fists clenched at his sides, watching his mother try to make the thing his father had designed, began to cough, and Clara dragged him outside and sat him on the cleared ground and made him breathe. And then she sat beside him, her eyes streaming, her palms pressed flat against the cold dirt, and she allowed herself for perhaps 2 minutes to consider the possibility that her husband had been wrong. It was the most dangerous 2 minutes of the autumn. The blizzard that was coming would not, when it came, be more dangerous than those 2 minutes, because the blizzard could only kill her body, and her body had already decided to keep going. What those 2 minutes threatened was something older and more necessary. They threatened the thing she had been holding on to since April, which was the belief that the man she had loved had not been a fool. If the design in the journals did not work, then Edmund had been a dreamer, and she had been a dreamer's wife, and the town had been right all along. and the only honest course left to her was to go down the hill to Harlon Croft and accept his offer and spend the next 3 years paying off a stove that would keep her children alive in the way a stove keeps children alive, which is to say, inefficiently and at a cost her husband would not have wanted her to pay. She sat with that possibility for the length of 2 breaths, and then she pushed it away because Eli was watching her, and because she had not yet read the journals as closely as she could, and because a fire that had failed once was not yet a fire that could not be made. She went back to the journals that night. She read for the 4th time Edmund's notes on the Rumford fireplace. She understood on the 4th reading what she had missed on the first 3, which was the matter of the throat. Thompson had written, and Edmund had underlined, that the throat of the flue had to be narrowed to 4 inches, no more, no less, and that this narrowing was not a decoration, but the engine of the draft. A fire could not pull its own smoke upward through a throat that was too wide because the warm air would lose heat to the walls of a wide flue faster than it could rise, and the draft would stall and reverse. She had built her firebox with a throat the width of her hand. It was too wide. She also understood in the same reading that the exit pipe at the far end of her bench was too short, and that the run through the bench itself would cool the smoke to the point where it had no buoyancy left by the time it reached the exit. She sat at the kitchen table and sketched a revised firebox, narrower, throat shallower, rear wall, taller, initial riser, to give the combustion a column of hot gas to pull against, and a longer exit pipe that would extend another 18 inches above the opening of the cave to catch what the journal called stack pressure. Then she blew out the lamp. She did not go back to the cave that night. She went to bed. She slept without dreaming, which was the first time in 5 months she had slept without dreaming. And she understood when she woke that what she had done by going to bed was to trust her husband for one more morning. Harlan came up the track a second time on the 7th of October. He had waited the week he had promised to wait, and he had come on the 8th morning, not to renew his offer, but to collect her. Yes, because a man like Harlon Croft does not offer a thing twice, and does not expect to have to. He came over the last rise, and he saw what she had done to the cabin, and he stopped walking. She had taken the north wall apart. Not all of it. The 2 lowest courses of logs were still in place, because they were load-bearing, and she had left the door frame intact. But the upper courses, the ones that had been poorly chinked, and would have failed first under a winter wind, had been carefully dismantled. Each log pried from its notch and carried down, and stacked in 3 neat rows beside the cave. The reason was plain to anyone who knew what she was building, which was that she needed the seasoned timber for the internal framing of the bench's chimney channels, and for the double door at the cave mouth, and for the interior shelving. And the reason the timber had to come from the cabin was that she had no money to buy timber from the mill, and no time to fell and season her own. It was in its way the most efficient choice she had ever made, and it was the choice that to Harlan Croft, standing at the top of the rise, could only mean one thing. She had given up, she had abandoned the cabin as a structure, and was pulling it apart for firewood, and, for he saw with a colder shock, whatever the project was behind it on the slope, the pit into the hillside that his wife had told him about 3 evenings before, over dinner, in a voice that had been trying not to sound alarmed. He walked down the last stretch of the track slowly, his boots careful on the loose gravel, and he stopped at the edge of where she was working, and he watched her for a full minute before she noticed him, and, when she did, she straightened up with a short plank of cabin wall in her hand, and the clay of her own bench smeared across the back of her wrist, and she did not put the plank down. "Mrs. Vance," he said. His voice was changed from the first visit. It was still level. It was no longer quite patient. I did not come here to argue with you. I came here to hear you tell me you had thought better of it. I have thought about it every night, she said. That is not the same thing. He looked past her at the cave. He could see the curve of the bench now from where he stood, the long, low spine of stone and packed earth running back into the dark. And he could see May sitting cross-legged on a flat rock a few feet from the entrance, arranging pieces of torn-down cabin wall in size order as though it were a game. He looked at the child, and he looked at the bench, and he looked at the mother with the clay on her wrist, and he did to his credit try. He tried for another moment to see what she saw. He could not. What he saw was a widow tearing down her children's shelter in order to build a mud pile in a hole in the ground. And there was no charitable reading of the picture that a man of his kind could reach. You are pulling apart the house your children sleep in, he said. And his voice went quiet in the way a voice goes quiet when a man has stopped trying to persuade and is only now recording what he sees. You are doing it to build a thing in a cave that your husband wrote about in a book. I came up here, Mrs. Vance, to offer you for the last time a crew and a stove and enough wood to see you to April. You can have the crew here tomorrow morning. You can have the stove in by sundown. You can keep your cabin and your children and your dignity, and I will not say a word about what I am looking at right now to anyone in this town. You have my word on that, but I need to hear you say yes. She set the plank down. She wiped her hand on her apron. She spoke more slowly than she had the first time because she had practiced this answer in the cave, and she wanted to get it exactly right. Mr. Croft, your stove shouts, my hearth is going to tell a story. She paused because the words had not come out quite the way she had rehearsed them, but they had come out close enough. You measure heat by how fast it arrives and how loud it comes. My husband learned to measure it by how long it stays and how evenly it spreads. Those are not the same measure. You cannot compare them the way you compare two stoves. I am not refusing your kindness. I am refusing your measure. If I am wrong about the measure, my children will be cold in 2 weeks, and I will come down this hill, and I will knock on your door, and I will accept every word of your offer, and I will owe you for the rest of my life. If I am right, you will not have to offer it again. That is the bargain I am asking you to let me make. He looked at her for a long time. He was not in that moment thinking about the cabin, or the cave, or the bench. He was thinking about the word measure, which she had used 3 times, and he was thinking that in 30 years of building roofs and stoves and walls, he had never heard any person, man or woman, use that word at him the way she had just used it. He did not know what to do with the feeling. He was accustomed to being thanked or being resisted, and this was neither. He put his hat back on. A week, he said, and his voice had gone flat. I will give you a week. If at the end of that week the cabin is not back up and a stove is not in it, I will come up here with the Reverend and my wife, and we will have a different conversation. Do you understand me, Mrs. Vance? I do not want that conversation. I am telling you now what it will be, so that you do not need to have it to understand what it is. She understood. She understood perfectly. She understood that he had just told her he was prepared to come back with the kind of concerned party that speaks of what might be best for the children. She understood that he meant it, and that he meant it without cruelty, which made it worse. She nodded once. She did not thank him. Gratitude in that moment would have been a lie. He walked back up the rise, and she watched him go. And when he was out of sight, she sat down on the flat rock beside May, and she put one arm around her daughter's small shoulders, and she said nothing. And May, without looking up from her pieces of wood, leaned her head against her mother's side, the way a small animal leans against a larger one for no other reason than that the larger one is there. That night in the cave, she built the second firebox. She built it to the revised dimensions she had sketched the night of the smoke. She built the throat to 4 inches no more and no less, measured twice with a string. She extended the exit pipe 18 inches above the lip of the cave mouth. She let the new clay cure for a day and a half, and on the evening of the 10th of October, she laid a small, careful pyramid of dry pine shavings at the back of the firebox. And she struck the match, and she held her breath, and she watched the flame take hold and climb into the narrow throat, and the draft caught, and the flame leaned forward into the throat, the way a horse leans into a harness when the load is right, and the smoke went where smoke was supposed to go through the bench, along the long serpentine channel she had packed, and out the extended pipe at the far end. And for a moment, just a moment, she could see from where she stood a thin, clean shimmer rising above the cave mouth into the cold October dark, and nothing else. No smoke, no smell, only heat going exactly where she had told it to go. She sat down on the cold floor of the cave with her back against the unfinished bench, and she put her face in her hands, and she did not weep, but her shoulders shook once, twice, and then were still. Eli was not in the cave. May was not in the cave. Nora was not in the cave. She was alone with the small red mouth of the firebox and the beginning of a warmth in the clay at her spine, and she said aloud to no one the things she had not been able to say at the kitchen table in September. All right, Edmund. All right. 2 hours later, she laid her palm flat on the upper surface of the bench nearest the firebox, where the heat would arrive first and the clay was warm, the way a sleeping animal is warm, even patient, alive. She moved her hand 4 feet down the bench toward the cave mouth, and the clay there was cooler but not cold. A cooler that meant the heat was traveling. She did not yet have a working hearth. She had a proof. She understood the difference, and she understood that the week Harlon Croft had given her was not enough time, and she understood that it did not matter because she was no longer working on his clock. She was working on the clock of the mountain outside, which had not yet begun to run at full speed, and she had the design now, and the design was real, and the rest was only labor. She banked the fire. She walked down the slope to the cabin in the dark, by memory without a lantern. She did not need the lantern. The cold air smelled different to her than it had an hour before. It smelled faintly and impossibly of something that was hers. The week that Harlon Croft had given her was not a gift. It was a countdown, and Clara Vance heard the ticking of it every morning when she woke in the cold cabin, and every night when she banked the small proving fire in the cave. She understood that the countdown was not only to the day he would come back up the slope with the Reverend and his wife. It was also to the day the mountain itself would stop giving her the margin it had given her so far. The second week of October in the high country was a season that pretended. The afternoons were warm enough that a person working outside could shed a coat. The nights were cold enough that the water in the goat's trough had a thin plate of ice across it by dawn. What the afternoons promised, the nights revoked, and Clara had begun to understand that the promises were the lie. She worked in the cave from first light until the sun dropped behind the western ridge, and then she worked another 3 hours by lantern. She no longer went down to the cabin for the noon meal. May brought her bread and a tin of cold beans and sat on the stump near the mouth of the cave while her mother ate and did not talk, because talking was one of the things Clara had stopped being able to do while working. Eli had taken on chores that a boy of 8 should not have been asked to take on, carrying water up from the creek in a pail that struck his knee with every step, feeding the goat, splitting kindling with the small hatchet his father had once bought him, as a birthday present he had not yet grown into. He did them without being asked. He did not speak of the cabin. He did not speak of the cave. He watched his mother carry stones that were too large for her, and he did not offer to help with them, because he had learned in the last fortnight that there were some things she needed to carry alone. And he had learned this by being told once quietly by the fire one night, and he had remembered. On the 12th of October, a light snow came down for 3 hours in the afternoon and did not stick. And by dusk, the ground was dry again, and the sky had gone that high cold blue that in the high country is not peace, but preparation. Nora Webb came up the track that evening with a jar of something under her arm, and she set the jar on the flat rock near the mouth of the cave, and she pointed at it with her chin. It was the heavy clay she had spoken of on the second visit, dark and dense, streaked with the red of the iron that gave it weight. "You'll want this on the last 4 feet of the bench," Nora said. "The end closest to the door. That's where you'll lose the heat first. Heavy clay there. It'll hold you another hour into the morning." Clara wiped her hands on her apron and said, because she had not said it before, and had been waiting for the right moment, "Why are you helping me?" And Nora, who did not look up from the jar, said in her dry, flat voice the thing that would stay with Clara for the rest of her life, which was, "I am not helping you, Mrs. Vance. I am helping the children who are going to come after yours." She did not explain the sentence. She did not need to. She picked up her empty sack and she went back down the slope. And Clara stood with the jar of heavy clay in her hands and understood that she had been trusted with something that was not about her. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table and she read the fourth journal of the 7, the one with the dark blue cloth binding, and on the 53rd page, she found what she had been hoping she would not find. Edmund had written in a section she had skimmed 3 times already, a single, careful paragraph about the matter of air in enclosed spaces. He had written that a fire consumed oxygen, and that a closed room with a fire in it would, over the course of a night, gradually fill with the invisible exhaust of that consumption, and that a man sleeping in such a room would not wake up feeling smothered. He would only feel tired. He would feel tired the way a man feels tired after a day of hard work, and he would attribute the feeling to the work, and he would go to bed again the next night, and the thing that killed him would be the thing he had stopped being able to notice. Edmund had underlined the word notice. Beneath the paragraph, in a smaller hand, he had written at the beginning of a calculation, the rough volume of a space, the rough rate of consumption of a pine fire, and then he had stopped. The calculation was not finished. There was no arrow to the next page. There was nothing. He had meant to come back to it, and he had not come back to it, and then he had died in the spring. And Clara, who had not opened this journal until that night, because she had been reading the others, sat at her kitchen table and understood that she had almost killed her own children without knowing. She put her forehead down on the cold wood of the table. She did not cry. She breathed. She thought about the night she had slept in the cave to test the warmth of the bench 4 nights before, with Eli and May in the cabin, and the little fire banked, and the 2 doors shut against the wind, and how she had woken at dawn, slightly heavy, in the head, a heaviness she had chalked up to the thin mountain air and her own exhaustion, and how she had been wrong. She had been tired in the way Edmund had warned about. She had not known to be afraid. She sat up. She reopened the journal to the page with the unfinished calculation, and she began with a stub of pencil and the back of an envelope to do what her husband had not lived long enough to do. She was not a mathematician. She did not know the formulas. She had only the principle he had given her, which was that the air in the cave had to be exchanged at some rate faster than the fire consumed it, and she had only the geometry of the cave itself, which she had measured with a length of string, and she had only the knowledge from the smoke of her first failed fire that air was already moving through the cave without her help, because air always moved when there was heat. She thought for a long time. She slept for 2 hours on the floor near the stove because the bed was too far away. She woke before dawn. She went back up the slope with a second shovel in her hand and a second length of clay-proofed wood under her arm, and she began to cut a second opening into the front lip of the cave, small no wider than her forearm, placed low and near the door on the opposite wall from where the exit flue rose. She worked through the morning and through the noon, and by late afternoon she had a draw hole the size of a dinner plate and a small wooden baffle that she could open and close with a cord. Fresh air would come in low where it was cold and heavy. Spent air would leave high through the flue and through a second small vent she had opened in the ceiling near the back of the cave. The convection would run on its own without her help for as long as the fire was warm and the world outside was cold, which was to say, for the entire winter. She sat on the stump afterward with the cord of the baffle in her hand, and she pulled it, and she felt the small exact shift of air on her cheek, and she understood that she had just solved a problem her husband had not solved. And the understanding arrived with a weight that surprised her. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was something quieter and older, which was the first time since April that she had done a piece of original work that had not been in the journal's work that was hers alone. She had loved Edmund. She had loved him the whole way. She had also, without saying so aloud even to herself, been held up by the weight of his knowing, by the sense that she had been his wife and was now his widow, and that the books on the shelf above the bed were the last of him, and must be preserved exactly as he had left them. What the baffle told her, sitting on the stump in the late October light, was that she could not preserve him exactly. She was going to have to finish him. The thought made her tired in a way that the work had not, and it also made her, for the first time since the burial, something other than tired. It made her someone with a task of her own. That evening, she set the full design to work for the first time. She laid the fire. She opened the low baffle 2 fingers width. She opened the high ceiling vent 1 finger. She lit the tinder in the narrow firebox, and the draft caught the way she had learned to expect it to catch. And the smoke went where smoke was supposed to go. And this time she sat inside the cave with both children beside her on a folded wool blanket while it burned, and she watched the color in the stone of the bench deepen from pale cream to the faint, warm cream of skin in firelight. And she watched May, who had never been warm all the way through, in the cabin, lean sideways and put her cheek against the lower curve of the clay, and close her eyes and not open them for 5 minutes. Eli sat with his hands on his knees, the way his father had sat. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, not looking at her, in a voice that was small and careful, "Mama, is this our house now?" And Clara, whose answer mattered more than any answer she had given him in his life, took her time. "It is going to be our house for the winter," she said. "In the spring, we will see what we want it to be. For now, it is our warm place." He nodded once. He did not argue. He did not ask when they would move in. He waited, which was a thing he had learned in the last 6 months to do, and it broke Clara's heart a little to see how well he had learned it. Harlon Croft did not come up the track on the morning that marked the end of the week he had given her. She had expected him and had been ready for him. The cabin untouched from the day he had last seen it, the stack of salvaged logs still beside the cave, the bench still unsealed along its last 4 feet. She had rehearsed in her head the sentences she would use. He did not come. Noon passed. Dusk passed. She banked the fire in the cave and walked down and slept in the cabin for one of the last times she would sleep in it. And, in the morning, she understood what his absence had meant, which was that he had not been prepared on the seventh day to make good on the threat he had made on the second visit, because the threat had not been a threat. It had been the only language he had. He had gone home at the end of that visit and had sat at his own kitchen table, and his wife Margaret had asked him what the widow had said, and he had told her and Margaret, who had known Clara in passing for 12 years and had liked her from the first, had said nothing for a long moment, and had then said in a voice that had cost her something, Harlon. Perhaps she has a reason. And Harlon, who had been married to Margaret for 29 years, and who had learned in those years to distinguish between the words his wife said to fill a silence and the words his wife said because they mattered, had not answered her that night. He had gone to bed. He had not come back up the slope in the morning. He had not come up in the afternoon. He had gone instead to the mill, and he had worked through the day the way he worked when he was trying not to think about a thing, and at the end of the day, he had walked the length of his own yard and stood for a long time looking up the valley at the thin, pale column of heat shimmer that rose almost invisibly from a spot on the hillside where, as far as he could tell from that distance, there was no chimney at all. He had stood there until the last light went, and he had gone inside without speaking to anyone, and had not told Margaret what he had seen, because he did not yet know what it meant. And he was not a man who spoke of things he did not yet know. The town did not forget. The town had only been waiting for Harlon to deliver the verdict. And when the verdict did not come, the town began to construct one of its own, because a town like Ironbell, in October of 1888, could not hold the image of Clara Vance in its mind without filing it under some category, and the category it settled on in the absence of Harlan's guidance was the category of the lost. The women at the general store began to speak of her in the past tense even while she was still walking past their windows. The men at the mill began to speak of the children in the future, tense the way people speak of children who will need to be placed. The Reverend, who was a kind man and not a cruel one, began to work on the language he would need when the placing became necessary. And he worked on it slowly and quietly, and he did not enjoy the work. None of this was hatred. Hatred would have been simpler to answer. This was the softer, deeper cruelty of a community that had run out of other things to do with a person and had begun to prepare gently and in advance for the moment of her removal. Clara felt it in the 10-second beat of silence that fell at the counter of the store when she came in to buy salt, a silence that had not been there the week before. She felt it in the way Eli came home from the one-room schoolhouse on a Tuesday in the third week of October with his jaw set hard, and she felt it again when he did not tell her what had happened that day, because he had decided at 8 years old that whatever had happened was not a thing she needed to carry on top of what she was already carrying. She asked him gently. He shook his head. He said, looking at his bowl of stew, Tommy Henderson said, our house was a hole in the ground. And then after a long pause, Miss Abbott asked why you won't let Mr. Croft fix our roof like a normal person. He did not look up. Clara set her spoon down. She did not answer right away. She was learning in those weeks that there were questions from her son that required her to stop being his mother for a breath and to become something older and more careful, a person whose job was not to comfort him, but to tell him the truth he was old enough to use. Eli, she said, I am not a normal person. Your father was not a normal person. That is not a thing to be proud of, and it is not a thing to be ashamed of. It is only a thing to know. He looked up. She met his eyes. Miss Abbott is not wrong to ask the question. She is wrong to think there is one answer. When you go back to school tomorrow, you do not have to defend me. You do not have to defend your father. You do not even have to answer her question. You can say that your mother is handling it. That is enough. That is your whole answer. Do you understand? He nodded slowly. He did not smile. He ate the rest of his stew. That night she sat by the stove for a long time after he had gone up to the loft, and she thought about how the cost of what she was doing was not a cost she was paying alone, and she thought about how she had not been told in any of the journals what to do about that cost. She had been told how to build a bench. She had not been told how to raise a boy whose classmates were learning to laugh at him for something his mother had decided to do. She moved the children into the cave on the 29th of October. She did not announce the move. She did not ask the town for help, and she did not tell Nora in advance. She chose the warmest afternoon of that week, and she carried the two beds up in pieces, the frames first, the ticking mattresses after, and she set them at the back of the cave where the bench was warmest and the ceiling was highest. She carried up the small kitchen table and the two chairs. She carried up the shelf of journals and the tin of flour and the tin of salt and the one copper pot that had been her mother's. She did not carry up everything. The cabin still held the heavier items, the chest of winter blankets, the spare lantern, the crate of potatoes. The cabin was not yet abandoned. It was demoted. She did not explain this to the children, and they did not ask her to. May walked into the cave on the evening of the 29th with her small bundle under her arm, and she looked around and she walked to the back where the bench made a low, warm ledge against the wall, and she sat down on the ledge, and she put her palms flat beside her, and she said in a voice of such simple pleasure that Clara felt her throat close, "Oh, Mama, it's like sitting on the sun." Eli did not speak at first. He stood at the entrance for perhaps a minute, with his bundle still in his hand. He walked slowly to the bed that had been set for him. He put the bundle on the bed. He sat on the bed. He looked at the bench and at the small firebox at the far end, and at the two shelves Clara had set into the stone wall for the books, and at the lantern hanging from the iron hook she had driven into a crevice of limestone above the table. He said very quietly, "It doesn't smell like the cabin." Clara waited. "No," she said. "It smells like what?" He thought for a moment. "Like warm bread," he said, "and the ground after rain." He was quiet again. Then he said in a voice that was a little older than he had been that morning, "I didn't know the ground could smell nice." That night he slept on the wool blanket on the floor near the bench, not in the bed she had made up for him. She did not correct him. She came in around midnight to bank the fire, and she saw him there on the floor, one arm flung out across the warm stone. His cheek pressed to the clay, the way May had pressed hers, and she understood that her son had answered in his sleep the question she had been afraid he would go on asking for the rest of his life. She sat by the bench for a while and watched him breathe, and then she got up and went to her own bed at the other end of the cave, and she slept for 7 unbroken hours, which was a thing she had not done since the April morning Edmund had left for the Prospect Trench. In the second week of November, a thing happened in the town that Harlon Croft would not for the rest of his life forget, and that Clara did not know about at the time and would not learn about for 3 more weeks. The Pemberton child. Silas Pemberton's youngest daughter, who was 5, who had been frail through the summer with a cough that came and went, fell into a worse cough in the first real cold of November. The Pembertons lived in one of the better houses in Ironbell, a house Harlan had built 7 years earlier, with a properly raised foundation and well-fitted logs, and an Iron Duke stove in the main room that Harlon himself had installed. They burned good dry fir. They had cordwood to spare. They had done everything the town's grammar of survival required them to do. The child got worse anyway. The doctor came up from the valley, a thin, quiet man named Arthur Hollis, who had been making the trip for 18 years, and who did not often say more than he had to. He examined the child. He sat with the parents in the kitchen afterward, and he said what he had been saying for 18 years to families in the high country, and what no one had wanted in 18 years to really hear. The child's lungs are dry. Silas, the air in the house is too dry, and there is too much of the stove's fine dust in it. She is not sick the way you think she is sick. She is sick from the air in her own house. Silas Pemberton, who was a decent man and a proud one, looked at the doctor and said in a voice that had flattened out in the last week, "Well, doctor, what would you have me do?" "Put the fire out." And the doctor, who was tired and who did not know the answer, said the only thing he could honestly say, which was, "I don't know, Silas. I wish I did." Harlon Croft was in that kitchen. He had come because he came to every house in the town when there was trouble, and because he had built this particular house and felt a particular responsibility for it. He heard the doctor. He did not say anything in the kitchen. He walked home slowly through the November dusk with his hands in his coat pockets, and he stopped on the bridge over the creek, which was a thing he did not usually do. And he stood looking at the black water, and he thought. He thought about the Iron Duke in the Pemberton house, and about the Iron Duke in his own house, and about the Iron Dukes in 30 other houses in Ironbell that he had sold and installed over the last decade. He thought about the dry air and the fine dust. He thought about the Pemberton child who had been a bright thing at 5 and was now a thin, wheezing thing at 5. And he thought about the phrase the doctor had used, sick from the air, in her own house, and the phrase would not let him go. He walked the rest of the way home in the dark. He went inside. He did not tell Margaret about the conversation with the doctor. He ate his supper and went to bed early, and he lay awake for most of that night, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, and in the small hours, without meaning to, he found himself thinking, for the first time in his life, a thought he had not permitted himself before, which was, "What if I have been wrong?" The thought did not resolve into anything. He did not get out of bed and walk up the hill. He did not send a message. He did not do anything because he was Harlon Croft. And Harlon Croft did not act on a single night's ceiling staring. But the thought had been thought. It had been let into the house of his mind, and once a thought has been let in, it does not leave, and in the days after the night on the bridge, Harlon began to notice things he had never noticed before. He noticed when he walked into his own parlor in the morning how the heat clung to the plank ceiling, and how the corner of the room nearest the north wall was always 3 or 4 degrees colder than the place near the stove. He noticed that his wife kept a shawl over her shoulders indoors, and that she had kept the shawl there all his life, and that he had always assumed it was because women ran cold. He noticed that his own hands, when he set them on the floor near the north wall, felt the chill of the earth beneath the planks. He noticed one evening at the saloon that Nora Webb was telling the bartender a story about her father's root cellar in the winter of 1856. How the potatoes had kept, because the cellar had been dug deep enough that the frost could not reach, how the temperature inside had held steady at 45 through a December when the air above ground had stood at 20 below for 9 days. She told the story without heat, the way she told every story, as though she were reporting the weather. The bartender had half listened. Harlon, 3 stools down, had heard every word. He had not approached her. He had not asked her to repeat anything. He had finished his drink, and he had gone home, and on the walk home he had thought for the second time in 2 weeks a thing he had not thought before, which was that there were older kinds of knowing in this valley than the kind he had built his mill on, and that his not having encountered them was not the same as their not being there. The cold deepened through the second week of November and into the third. On the morning of the 21st, the thermometer on the porch of the general store read 6 below at sunrise, and by 10 it had only climbed to 12 above, and the men of Ironbell began, without any of them saying so, to move their cordwood closer to their cabin doors. The saw at the mill ran longer hours. The smoke plumes thickened above the roofs. Harlan went from house to house in the afternoons, checking fittings, tightening a flue, here sealing a gap there, delivering to 3 of the poorer families an extra cord of fur at his own expense and without explanation. He worked hard. He did not sleep well. He did not look up the valley at the thin pale column of heat shimmer on the hillside, because he had looked at it enough times by now to know it was still there. And looking was not going to tell him anything more than he already knew, which was that the widow had not come down the hill and knocked on his door. In the cave on the hillside, the life that Clara had made for her children began in the third week of November to take on the cadence of something that could last. She woke before dawn and lit the small fire in the narrow firebox, and the bench drew the heat into itself over the next 90 minutes. And by the time the children woke, the stone beneath them was already warm. She made bread on the surface of the bench nearest the firebox, where the clay held a steady heat like a low oven, and the bread came out slightly chewy and tasting faintly of iron and stone. She taught Eli and May at the small table after breakfast the way she had taught them at the cabin kitchen, reading from a primer and then from the book of Psalms, and Eli, who had been a restless student in the cabin, became a quieter and more focused student in the cave, because the cave did not have the constant low draft of the cabin that had pulled his attention sideways. She walked down to the creek once a day for water, and she walked to the general store twice a week for salt and flour, and to pay in small, careful installments a bill that Mr. Coulter at the store had not pressed her on. She knew each time she walked in that conversation behind the counter stopped and then resumed differently. She did not mind. She had room for that now. She had a warm place to come back to, and her children were not coughing, and May had begun to sing quietly and tunelessly while she played on the floor of the cave, a small private melody that Clara had not heard from her since the March before her father had died. On the evening of the 22nd of November, Eli came into the cave from school with a bruise on his cheekbone and his shirt torn at the collar, and with a look on his face that was not anger and was not shame, but was a kind of stunned unwillingness to explain. Clara sat him down on the warm edge of the bench. She wet a cloth with warm water from the pot and pressed it gently against his cheek. She did not ask. She waited. He sat for perhaps 3 minutes with the cloth against his face. Then he spoke. Tommy Henderson said, "Papa was a fool who got killed because he didn't know how to work in a real mine." His voice was very flat. He said only a fool's son would live in a cave. Clara did not move the cloth. She did not answer at once. She felt in her chest a thing rise that she had not felt since the morning of the burial. A hot, hard anger that had nowhere honest to go, because Tommy Henderson was 9 years old and was repeating almost certainly the exact words of his father over the dinner table. She breathed through it. She set the cloth down. "Eli, look at me." He looked. Your father was not a fool. Your father was a man who asked questions that the other men in this valley were not interested in asking, and the cost of asking those questions in this valley is that when you die, the other men get to tell stories about you that are not true, and those men's sons will repeat the stories because they are 9 years old and they do not yet know how to tell the difference. She paused. Do you know the difference? He was quiet. He was thinking. Then he said, yes. Then a moment later, I think. She nodded. She did not push. It is going to take you a long time to know the difference all the way. That is all right. You do not have to know it all at once. You only have to know tonight that your father was not a fool, and that the reason you are warm right now is because of what he wrote down. Eli touched the bench beside him. He looked at his hand. He looked at her. Mama, can I show Tommy the cave? She smiled for the first time in several days. Not yet. Not while he is still the kind of boy who would repeat his father's words to you in a schoolyard. A year from now, if he is a different boy, perhaps. For now, this is ours. He nodded. He accepted the answer. He picked up the book of Psalms and he read aloud to May until bedtime. And the cave was warm, and the low baffle moved gently at the door, and outside, the sky had gone the color of old lead. It was on the morning of the 23rd that the sky told the valley what was coming. Clara walked out of the cave at first light to fetch water, and she stopped on the slope and she looked up, and what she saw was a sky that had no color in it at all. Not blue, not gray. A pale, drained, metallic non-color that she had seen once before in her life on a morning in Nebraska when she had been 9 on a day her mother had pulled her inside before the first flake had fallen and had not let her out again for 3 days. She stood with the empty bucket in her hand, and she understood. Down in the town, the oldest men of Ironbell stood on their porches and looked up and understood the same thing. And none of them said a word to each other because there was nothing to say that their wives did not already know from the looks on their faces. Harlon Croft, coming out of his house to walk down to the mill, stopped at his gate and looked up, and his hand went to the wooden rail of the gate and stayed there for a long moment, and then he turned around and went back into the house, and he told Margaret without preamble, I need you to fill every vessel in this house with water. Now, before the pump freezes. Margaret looked at his face for 1 second. She did not ask him why. She got up from the table and she began. By noon, the wind had started not hard, only a steady, low push out of the northwest, the kind of wind that is the scout for something larger. By 3, the first flakes had begun to fall. Not in the gentle, spiraling pattern of an ordinary snow, but in small, dense grains, almost more ice than flake, that ticked against the windows of every house in the valley with the sound of sand thrown against glass. By dusk, the wind had doubled and then doubled again, and by the time Clara had brought in the last of the wood from the pile beside the cave and had fastened the outer door and set the inner rug across the gap beneath it, the world outside the cave had become a single, unbroken scream of white. Inside the cave, the fire burned as it had burned every evening for 3 weeks. Clara laid it small and tight in the narrow firebox, and the draft caught, and the smoke went where it was supposed to go, and the bench took the heat into itself the way it had learned. She had prepared for this night since October. She had 2 cords of dry wood stacked along the inside wall near the door, enough for 15 days of small, efficient fires. She had flour and salt and cornmeal and dried beans. She had a jar of Nora's heavy clay set into the last 4 feet of the bench, which would hold the last heat of the morning, an hour longer than the lighter mix. She had a baffle that would regulate the fresh air coming in at the floor, and a second vent that would regulate the spent air leaving at the ceiling. And she had, for the first time in her life, a home whose behavior she understood completely. Nora Webb came in an hour after the wind had started. She did not knock. She pushed her way through the outer door with snow already packed into the collar of her coat and a canvas bundle under her arm, and she stood in the warmth of the cave for perhaps 10 seconds, blinking the ice from her lashes. And then she said the way she said everything without drama, "Is there room?" Clara looked at her. She understood that Nora had walked in the rising wind from the last cabin at the east end of Ironbell to the cave on the hillside, which was a walk of perhaps a mile and a half, and that Nora had done it in the last possible window before the walk would have killed her. "Yes," she said, "there is room." Nora set her bundle down. She did not explain. She sat on the warm edge of the bench, and she put her hands flat on the clay, and she closed her eyes for a moment the way a person closes her eyes when she has been cold for a very long time and has just stopped being cold. Then she opened her eyes, and she said in the direction of the children, not to them exactly, but toward them, "I used to cough when I was your age. I don't cough anymore." Eli looked at her. He nodded once seriously. May smiled and went back to the small pile of stones she was arranging on the floor. The storm that the old trappers of the high country would later call the Great Blizzard of 1888 settled over Ironbell like a hand closing over a moth. The temperature on the porch of the general store, which no one was any longer brave enough to walk out and check, was later estimated to have dropped to 34 below at midnight and to have gone on dropping through the second day. The wind held at a level that none of the men in town had seen in their lives. In the Croft house, Harlan banked his stove as high as he dared, and stood in the middle of his parlor, and felt the heat hammering off the iron duke on one side of his face, and the cold pouring through the north wall on the other side, and he watched with a builder's professional horror as a fine line of frost began to form along the seam of the wall at the floor, and then to climb the wall inch by inch over the course of the first night, until by morning the lower 18 inches of the north wall of his own house had a pale sheen of ice on them that his stove could not touch. He did not say anything to Margaret. He fed the stove. In the cave, the storm was a rumor. The outer door thudded sometimes when a gust struck it square, and the low baffle fluttered a little in its cord, and once in the middle of the first night, May sat up and asked in a sleepy voice what the sound was, and Clara said from the bench, where she was not quite sleeping, "That is the wind trying to find us. It cannot." May thought about this for a moment. Then she lay back down. Then she said even more sleepily, "Good." And she did not wake again until morning. Nora slept on a pallet near the door with her hand tucked under her cheek. Eli slept in his bed. Clara lay awake for most of that first night, not because she was afraid, but because she was listening. She was listening to the cave. She was listening to the small ticks and whispers of the bench as it gave its heat to the low, steady pull of the draft, at the baffle to the almost silent rise of the spent air out through the ceiling vent. The cave was working. The cave was doing what her husband on paper 4 years before had said a cave like this one could be made to do. She lay in the dark, and she thought about Edmund, and she thought about how the thing he had given her was not a cave, and was not a bench, and was not a journal. The thing he had given her was a way of listening to the earth that the men of Ironbell had never been taught. She turned her face toward the back wall, and she said silently against the warm stone the things she had not yet written in the journal, and that she understood now she would write at the end of the winter. Thank you. And then a moment later, I will finish the rest of it. And then she slept. On the morning of the second day of the blizzard, with the wind still at full strength and the world outside still a single, unbroken scream, Harlon Croft stood in his own parlor in front of the Iron Duke, and he watched his woodpile through the kitchen window. And he understood with the cold, clear honesty of a man who had spent 30 years doing arithmetic on lumber that he had not built the house he had thought he had built, and that the cost of that error was going to be paid, not by him, because he was a strong man in a strong house, but by the weakest families in the valley. The Pembertons, the old Henderson couple, the widow Peel, and by his own wife, who was already wearing 2 shawls and had moved her chair to the south side of the room because the north half had gone cold in a way his stove could not answer. He did not speak. He watched the woodpile. He did the arithmetic a second time, and it came out the same. He turned away from the window. He went to the kitchen. He began to dress slowly and deliberately for a walk he had not yet decided to take, because Harlon Croft was a man who dressed for what he might need to do before he had admitted to himself that he was going to do it. Harlon Croft did not finish dressing on the second morning. He pulled the second coat halfway over his shoulders, and he stopped in the middle of his kitchen with one arm through a sleeve, and he stood there for the better part of a minute, with his breath clouding in the thin indoor air, because his wife Margaret was watching him from the chair she had pulled to the south side of the room, and the look on her face was the look of a woman who already knew what her husband was about to do, and was waiting to see whether he would lie to her about it. He did not lie. He did not speak at all. He pulled the coat the rest of the way on. He took his muffler from the peg by the door, and he wound it twice around his neck and face, leaving only a slit for his eyes, and he tied the leather cord of his hat under his chin. Margaret did not get up. She said from her chair in a voice that was not angry and not afraid, and was only the flattest register of a long marriage, where Harlon. And he, with his hand on the latch of the kitchen door, said the only honest thing he could say, which was, "Up the hill. Don't wait on me. If I'm not back by dark, put another log on and don't open this door for anyone but me." He did not look at her as he said it. He could not. He opened the door into the scream of the wind, and he stepped through, and he pulled it shut behind him, and the latch clicked, and Margaret sat alone in her parlor, with the north wall already whitening again, and understood that her husband had just gone out into a blizzard to apologize to a woman, and that he did not yet know that was what he was doing. The walk was 200 yards. In ordinary weather, it was a walk of 4 minutes. Harlon took it in an hour and 10, and in the 7th minute, he went down for the first time, and in the 23rd minute, he went down for the second time, and in the 44th minute, he stopped being able to feel his own face. The snow came up to his thighs at the low places, and to his ribs where the drifts had cupped against the rail fence along the Pemberton property line, and each step was a separate argument he had to win with his own legs. He did not think about the widow. He did not think about the bench or the cave or the column of heat shimmer he had watched from his yard on the evening he had not told Margaret about. He thought about the next step. He thought about the step after that. He thought, when he was able to think at all, about the Pemberton child wheezing in a bed a quarter-mile behind him, and about his wife sitting in a chair on the south side of their parlor with 2 shawls over her shoulders, and he understood with the simple clarity that cold gives a man whose mind has been crowded for 30 years that he had run out of other places to go. He found the ruin of the Vance cabin first. It was barely a ruin. It was a set of corner logs rising out of a white mound like the broken fingers of a buried hand. and he almost walked past it because the wind had scoured the drift into strange shapes, and there was nothing left of the roof line to orient by. He stopped when his boot struck the top of what he realized was the old granite foundation, and he looked down and saw under a thin crust of wind-glazed snow the pale edge of dry-laid stone he had crouched beside in September and judged and dismissed. He stood over it for perhaps 10 seconds. He did not feel vindication. He felt something closer to embarrassment. The small, cold embarrassment of a man who has been asked to evaluate a house by a standard he has only now understood was the wrong standard, and who has been wrong in public, and who cannot take the wrongness back. He turned uphill. He went on. He saw the steam before he saw anything else. He had been watching for the thin column of shimmer he had watched from his yard, and in the white smother of the storm, he had not expected to see it at all, because he had assumed the wind would tear apart any plume a small fire could produce. The plume was not a plume, it was a thread. A single, clean line of disturbance in the air. Perhaps no thicker than his thumb, rising straight up for 3 feet above the snowpack. Before the wind took it, and it was rising from a spot in the hillside where the snow was a little lower. Because the snow above whatever vent that was had been melting from beneath at a steady, quiet rate all through the storm, and was continuing to melt, and the refreezing, and the further melt had carved a small clear chimney up through the drift, and out of that chimney came the thread of warm air. He stood in the wind, and he looked at the thread, and for the first time in his life, he did not know how to speak to a thing he was seeing with his own eyes. He found the door by following the thread down. It was not visible at first. The drift had climbed the face of the cleft to a height of perhaps 5 feet, and the outer door that Clara had built of stacked plank and straw and pegged clay was buried behind a curtain of snow. He dug with his gloved hands. He found the top edge of the door, and he worked downward until he had cleared the latch. He braced his shoulder against the frame. He pulled the door outward against the weight of the snow that had piled against it, and it gave by perhaps 4 inches, and a warm breath came out into his face, a breath that smelled of wood fire and bread, and the dry, faint mineral smell of heated limestone, and Harlon Croft, who had not wept since the burial of his father in 1862, felt his eyes fill and freeze at the lashes in the same instant. He pulled the door the rest of the way open. He stepped in. He fell. He did not fall hard. He slid down the short slope of packed clay that formed the entry ramp and came to rest on his hands and knees on a floor of warm stone, and the warm stone was the first warm thing his body had touched in 40 minutes, and it arrived up through his gloves and up through his knees into him in a way he could not describe and could not refuse. He stayed on his hands and knees for the space of 3 breaths. Then he lifted his head. May was the first thing he saw. She was sitting on the far edge of the bench, with her feet tucked up under her, and she had a biscuit in her hand, and she looked at him with the ordinary curiosity of a child who had been told that a visitor might come. She said in the clear, unsurprised voice of a 6-year-old, "Hello, Mr. Croft. Mama said you would get here before dinner." Eli was beside her. He did not speak, but he stood up, and the standing was a small formal thing, as if he had been taught between the first visit and the second, that when a man comes to your home in a storm, you stand. Nora Webb was on a pallet near the bench, with her coat off, and her gray braid loose across one shoulder, and she was knitting, and she did not look up. Clara was standing beside the firebox at the back, with a wooden spoon in one hand and a tin cup in the other, And she crossed the cave to him without any hurry at all. And she crouched down so that her face was level with his on the floor. And she held the cup out to him. Warm water first, she said. Before you try to talk, drink half of it. He took the cup. His hand was shaking not from fear, but from the uneven return of circulation. He drank. The water had been kept on the bench and was the temperature of a spring creek. Not hot, not cold. The exact temperature that a body pulled from the edge could accept without shock. He understood that too. He understood that she had set this cup aside for him. He drank the half she had asked for. He handed the cup back. He did not stand yet. He looked around the cave from the floor, and he saw what a man like Harlon Croft, who had spent 30 years looking at the bones of houses, could see that another man would not. He saw the line of the bench, and he saw how it curved toward the door, so that its warmest section was where a visitor would arrive. He saw the two vents low at the door and high at the back, and he saw the faint, steady pull of air at the low one that told him the convection was running on its own without needing to be fed. He saw the firebox and the narrow throat above it, and he saw that the throat was exactly the width it needed to be, and he understood from the width that whoever had built this thing had read a great deal and had also failed at least once and had then read more, because no first draft of such a throat was ever that width. He saw the double door behind him with its inner rug and its outer plank, and he saw the small shelf of books set into the rock, and he saw the two beds at the back of the cave with their quilts folded neatly at the foot. And he saw that nothing in the room was ostentatious, and nothing in the room was decorative, and every single thing in the room was working. He sat back on his heels. His hands were still on the floor. He could feel the warm stone through his gloves. He looked up at Clara, and he said, and the words came out hoarse, because his throat was still thawing, Mrs. Vance, "I have been wrong." She did not answer for a moment. She was not going to make the moment smaller than it was by rushing to fill it. She waited long enough for him to hear his own sentence out in the warm air of the cave, and then she said with no triumph at all, "Drink the rest of the water, Mr. Croft. There is bread on the bench when you can stand." He drank the rest of the water. He got to his feet slowly, not because his legs were weak, but because he did not want to stand too quickly in a room that had changed the shape of him. He walked the 2 steps to the bench, and he put his bare hand flat on it, where May pointed, and he felt the warmth come up through the stone, and he understood that the warmth was not coming from a fire currently burning. The firebox at the back was a bed of low gray coals, no larger than a man's fist. The warmth in the stone under his palm had been put there hours earlier. It had been put there by the hot breath of a small, tight fire that had been fed cleanly enough to leave no smoke behind. And the stone had kept the heat, the way a sleeping body keeps heat, and would go on keeping it long after the last coal had gone cold. Harlon had sold 100 Iron Dukes. He had never once in the selling of any of them told a buyer that the stove could do this. He had not told them because it could not. He did not ask the obvious first question, the one about the design, because he already had the design in his eyes. He asked the question a builder asks when he is trying to recalibrate every number he has carried in his head for 30 years. How much wood, Mrs. Vance? Since the storm started. How much wood have you burned? She walked to the stack along the inner wall. She pointed to a mark she had drawn in charcoal on one of the upper logs. From there to there, 3 days. A little under a cord and a quarter. He looked at the mark. He looked at the stack. He did the arithmetic. He had burned in his own stove in the same 3 days between 5 and 6 cords. He had watched the pile go. He had known the number without needing to count. The number Clara had just shown him was less than a fifth of what he had burned. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, she was already looking past him at the door. "Mr. Croft," she said, and her voice had shifted, had become more direct, because the moment for his private reckoning was over, and there was work to do. "How is the Pemberton child?" He swallowed. "Bad," he said. "She was bad on the morning it started. She will be worse now." Clara nodded once. She had known the answer before she had asked. She had been turning the question over in her head since the first gust. She said evenly, without the slightest suggestion that she was asking his permission. "This cave holds 15. Comfortably. 20 if we are careful. I can take the Pembertons tonight. I can take the Peel widow tomorrow if you can reach her. I need you to tell me who else." He did not hesitate. "The old Hendersons on the Creek Road. Their roof is low, and their wood pile is half what mine is. And the Coulter boys have a sister at their house. She is up from Denver visiting, and she is not used to this cold. That is 5 adults and 3 children and the sick girl. 10 in all." Clara did the sum with her eyes on the bench. 10, she said. "Yes. 10 works. We will need more water hauled in before we fetch anyone. We will need the outer door clear and a second blanket on the Peel pallet. You and I will go for the Pembertons first, because the girl cannot wait. Nora will stay with the children." Nora, who had not looked up from her knitting during any of this, said without stopping her needles, "That is correct." Eli was already on his feet. "Mama, I can haul the water." Clara looked at him. She saw what he was asking for, and she saw what it cost him to ask. She said, "Yes. You can. You take the small bucket. You make 4 trips. You do not go past the wood pile. You come straight back each time. Do you hear me?" He heard her. It took them an hour to walk the Pembertons up the hill, because the Pemberton man insisted on carrying his daughter wrapped in 3 quilts against his chest, and would not let his wife carry her. And because the wife was slower than either of them through the drifts, and twice she fell, and twice Harlon reached down without speaking and set her back on her feet and did not let go of her elbow afterward. The girl did not cry on the walk. The girl by then did not have the air in her lungs to cry. They came in through the outer door of the cave at dusk, and the warmth hit them the way it had hit Harlon, not as a wall, but as an arrival. And the Pemberton man, whose name was Silas, and who had not spoken 3 words, the whole of the climb stood inside the door, with his daughter still pressed against his chest. And he looked at Clara, and he opened his mouth, and he shut it again, and what came out finally was, "Mrs. Vance, I owe you." And Clara, who had been pulling the inner rug across the gap at the door, said without looking up, "You owe me nothing. Put the child on the bench. The warm end. Not near the door." Silas Pemberton walked the 4 steps to the warm end of the bench. He laid his daughter down on the clay. The child, whose lungs had been narrow all afternoon, drew her first full breath in 30 hours, as the heat came up into her back through the quilts, and she made a small sound that was not a cough, and was not a cry. And was, her mother said later, the sound of a lamp being turned up. The mother put her hands over her face. Harlon stood near the door with his hat in his hands. He did not look at anyone. They did the Peels that night after the wind had dropped by a single increment, because the Peel widow lived closer, and because Nora had said, not looking up, that the wind would drop after midnight for 2 hours before rising again, and she had been right about weather her whole life. They did the Hendersons at first light. They did the Coulter sister and her brothers in the late morning. By noon on the fourth day, there were 11 people in the cave, including Clara and the children. And the bench that had been built for 3 was holding 10 of them without strain, and the air at the floor was fresh, and the air at the ceiling was leaving as it should. And the small fire at the back of the firebox burned for a little longer that evening than it had burned the evenings before, and that was all it needed to do. The Pemberton child slept through that night without coughing. Her mother did not sleep at all, because she kept a hand on her daughter's chest and counted the breaths, and would not trust yet what her own ears were telling her. On the morning of the 5th day, the wind was gone. There was no dramatic moment of clearing. The wind simply was not there when the first person woke, and the silence it left behind was so complete that May, who had slept through every previous night of the storm, woke to the silence instead, and sat up and said into the warm air of the cave, "Mama." The sound stopped. Clara was already up. She was at the door with her hand on the latch. She looked back at her daughter. She said yes. It stopped. "We are going to see what it left us." She opened the outer door. The world beyond the door was not a landscape. It was a new country. The drift against the slope above the cave mouth had reshaped the entire face of the hillside, and the drift across the wagon track had risen above the top of the Vance woodshed, and the low cabins of Ironbell in the valley below had become a series of long white mounds with only their stovepipes showing thin dark lines rising out of the white at odd angles, some of them still smoking, some of them cold. The sky above the valley was a blue so clean and so hard that it hurt to look at. The sun on the new snow was blinding. Clara stood in the doorway for a long time. She heard somewhere down the valley a single clear ring of an axe, and then another and another, and she understood that the men of Ironbell had already begun to dig. She stepped back into the cave. She said to Harlon, who was standing behind her, already dressed, "We need to find out who we lost." They did not lose anyone. That was the thing the town would not stop saying afterward for the rest of the winter and into the spring. In a storm that the oldest trappers of the range had said was the worst in 50 years, in a valley of 300 souls, in conditions that had killed, as they would learn over the following weeks from the papers that came up from Denver, 150 people across the plains, and the Front Range Ironbell lost no one. Not a child, not an old person, not a house burned to the ground because a stove had been fed too hot in a panic. 6 families had their roofs come in or partially in. 2 families whose men were bachelors with small cabins at the edge of the timber walked down into the town on the 5th morning and admitted they had been considering on the 3rd night whether they could make it to Harlon Croft's door, and had decided they could not, and had spent the 4th night burning their kitchen table piece by piece to keep the stove going. They had lived. They had not lost anyone. The Pemberton child coughed for 2 more weeks and then stopped coughing, and in March her mother would bring her up the hill to the cave and set her on the warm bench and watch her eat a biscuit that May had made, and would cry quietly into a handkerchief while Claire pretended not to see. But that was later. On the 5th morning, there was only the digging. Harlon went down first with a shovel he had brought up with him on the first trip and had left leaning inside the door, and he broke a path from the cave mouth to the top of the wagon track. And then he and the Pemberton man and the older of the Coulter boys broke a path from the top of the wagon track down to the general store, because the store was the first place that needed to be opened, and because Mr. Coulter, who had been alone in the living quarters above the store through the whole storm with a stove he had mistrusted for 5 years, was, they thought, the next most fragile man in Ironbell, after the Pemberton child. He was alive, he was cold, and he was hungry, and his stove had gone out on the second night, and he had moved his bedroll into the root cellar under the store, and he had slept there for the last 2 nights because the cellar, he told them when they dug him out, had held warmer than his own parlor. He said this as a simple fact, and he did not yet understand, as he said it, that he had just reported to the 2 men digging him out the central premise of the thing that had saved the widow. Harlon heard him. Harlon did not say anything. Harlon helped Mr. Coulter up the cellar stairs and set him on a stool near the store's main stove and went back out and kept digging. By noon of the 5th day, there were paths between most of the houses. By dusk, there were paths to all of them. The mill did not open. No one suggested that it should. The men of Ironbell spent the 5th day and the 6th day and the 7th day doing what men do after a storm that has not killed them, which is walking slowly from house to house, accounting for every living body, fixing what can be fixed, mourning what cannot, and in the corners of kitchens and on the porches of the general store, beginning quietly to tell each other the story of what had happened. The story in those first days was not yet the story of the widow. The story was the storm. But by the end of the first week after, when the Pembertons had told their part 3 times at 3 different tables, and when Harlon Croft had been seen twice walking up the wagon track to the cave with a shovel on his shoulder and nothing to explain, and when Nora Webb, coming back down from the hill one evening, on her own 2 feet had walked past the bench where 4 men were sitting smoking, and had said, without being asked, only the single sentence, "She saved her children." And then she saved yours, and had walked on the story of Clara. Vance had begun to change its shape in the mouths of the people of Ironbell. The change did not happen in a week. It did not happen in a month. The valley's grammar for reading a person built on the height of a woodpile and the thickness of a chimney plume did not bend in an evening. What bent in the first weeks was Harlon Croft, and the rest of the valley followed him, because the valley had always followed him, and because Harlon Croft was a man who, when he understood that he had been wrong, did not retreat into silence, but did the more difficult thing, which was to move visibly and in public toward the person he had been wrong about, and to stand near her until the town was forced to look at the 2 of them, and to understand that whatever old sentence it had been writing about her could no longer be finished in the old way. He did not make speeches. He did not apologize at the store. He walked with his shovel up the wagon track, and when the men at the mill the following Monday looked up and saw him coming back down at noon with a length of dressed pine under his arm, clearly taken up the hill that morning, and apparently no longer needed, they understood without anything being said that Harlon Croft was doing carpentry for the widow, and they understood because they were not stupid men that this was not charity, it was study. It was in the last week of November, with the snow packed down and the paths between houses firm, Harlon came up the track on a morning when Clara was alone in the cave and had a notebook open on the small table. He did not come with a shovel that morning. He came with a tin of coffee and a small brown paper parcel of sugar, which were 2 things he understood to be in short supply in our household. And he set them on the table without ceremony, and he sat on the stool across from her. And he said, without preamble, in the flat, working voice of a man who has come to do a job, "Mrs. Vance, I am going to ask you to teach me." She looked at him across the table. She did not smile. She understood what he was offering, and she understood what he was not offering. And she understood that the thing he was not offering was an apology, not because he was unwilling to give it, but because he had decided that the better apology was the question he had just asked. She said, "That will take the whole winter, Mr. Croft, and then the spring, and then some of the summer." He said, "I know." she said, I will not soften it for you. Some of what I will teach you will contradict things you have told men in this valley for 20 years. You will have to untell them in public, and you will have to stand for the untelling. Are you prepared for that? He said without hesitation, yes. She said, then we start with air. Not fire, air. Because everything else follows from air. And he took out a notebook of his own, which he had brought in the breast pocket of his coat, without showing her. And he set it on the table, and he uncapped a pencil, and he waited. They worked through December. They worked through January. They worked through the deep cold of February when the temperature fell again for a week to 25 below, and the men of Ironbell, for the first time in living memory, did not panic at the reading of the thermometer, because they had watched a woman on the hill and a man at the mill work through the fall and the early winter on something, and they had not yet been told what it was, but they had begun to suspect in the way a town suspects a thing before it has been named, that whatever the something was, it was going to matter. In March, when the first thaws came, Harlon went to the mill and gave 2 orders that the men of the mill would remember. The first was that the mill would, for the rest of the year, produce no more floors of dry-laid granite foundation stone for any house he built, because he had come to understand that such a foundation drew the heat of a home down into the bedrock. The second was that the mill would, beginning in April, cut and shape at his expense a run of dressed limestone blocks to a specification he would give them for use as the interior core of a new design of hearth, and that the design would be made available without fee to any man in Ironbell who wished to rebuild. He did not name the design. He did not need to. By the end of the first week of April, 7 families in the valley had come to him separately and had asked whether the design was real, and whether he would help them build one, and whether the widow would come down from the hill and look at their houses and tell them what to change. Harlon said yes to all 3 questions. Clara, when he asked her that evening at the cave, said yes to the third with one condition, which was that she would not take money for any consultation, and that if the men of the valley wished to pay her for her time, they could do it in cordwood delivered to her door, so that she would not again spend a winter counting logs. Harlon agreed. The men agreed. The first 7 hearths of what the valley by June had begun to call the Vance hearths were broken ground on in the last week of April, and the first of them was fired for the first time on the evening of the 29th of May in the parlor of the Pemberton house, and the Pemberton child, who was 6 by then and had grown 2 inches over the winter, was the one who laid the first match to the tinder, because her father had asked Clara whether that would be appropriate, and Clara had said that it would be more than appropriate. It would be correct. Nora Webb did not come to the Pemberton lighting. Nora did not come to any of the lightings that spring, though she was invited to each one. She stayed in her cabin at the east end of Ironbell, and she sold her eggs, and she did not speak when she came into the store of the cave, or of the winter, or of the thing the valley had begun to call her part in. When a newspaper man from Denver came up to Ironbell in July to write a feature piece on the widow who had saved a town with her husband's journals, and asked at the general store where he might find a Mrs. Nora Webb, he was told not rudely but firmly by Mr. Coulter that Mrs. Webb did not give interviews, and that if he valued his welcome in Ironbell, he would not go to her door. The newspaper man did not go. The feature piece, when it ran in the Denver paper on the 1st of August, named Clara Vance and Harlon Croft, and made a romantic paragraph of the storm and the cave, and did not name Nora at all, which was the outcome Nora had arranged for and the outcome she wanted. She had said to Clara once in March, standing at the mouth of the cave looking down at the valley. The paper will want a name. Mrs. Vance, let them have yours. I have carried names for people in this valley for 60 years. This one I will not carry. And Clara, who had understood by then what was under the sentence and what was not, had said only, all right. The years moved. They moved the way years move in a small valley that has found without fanfare a way of living that works. By 1891, there were 23 Vance hearths in Ironbell and 17 more in the neighboring settlements along the high country, and the Iron Duke stoves that had been the pride of Harlan's mill. In 1887 had become by the fall of 1891 the thing the mill no longer sold, and the front window of the mill office held a small unlettered display of a cutaway model of a masonry core, which Harlan had built with his own hands, and which he would have asked, and if his schedule permitted, take out of the window and walk through with any visiting man who wanted to understand it. Eli grew. He was 12 in the fall of 1891, and 13 the next year, and he was already by the spring. He turned 14, the kind of student who asked questions in the Ironbell schoolhouse that the teacher, Miss Abbott, could not always answer, and Miss Abbott, who was no longer the woman who had once asked him why his mother would not let Mr. Croft fix the roof, had learned to say when she could not answer, "You should ask your mother, and to mean it as a compliment." May was 10 and 11 and 12, and she sang now in the church choir, and she helped her mother in the spring and summer months when families came from as far as the Gunnison country to ask about the hearths, and she had a quiet, confident way of explaining the principle of the heavy clay at the door end of the bench that made grown men nod slowly and take their hats off without quite knowing why. Harlon Croft died in the winter of 1904. He was 68. He had been ill through the fall with a thing in his chest that Dr. Hollis had diagnosed honestly and had offered no cure for, and he had spent the last 6 weeks of his life on the advice of Dr. Hollis and his own wife and his own stubborn preference, not in his own house, but in the cave on the hillside, on a pallet set for him on the warm end of the bench, because it was the most comfortable place in the valley for a man whose lungs were failing. Clara took care of him in those 6 weeks. She was 50 by then. Margaret Croft came up every morning and sat with him for the afternoon hours, and Clara did the nights. And in the last week, when he could no longer sit up, Margaret stayed in the cave with him and slept on a second pallet Clara had laid for her, and the two women took the watches in turn. He did not speak much in the last week. On the afternoon of the 17th of December, with the light coming in through the partly open inner door and falling across the stone of the bench, in the particular pale way it fell in mid-afternoon. In the winter, he asked Clara, whose hand he was holding, whether she would bring him the Cordovan journal. She did. She set it on his chest. He did not have the strength to open it. He asked her to open it to the page with the map. She did. He looked at the map for a long time. He put his finger not quite steadily on the small wedge on the hillside that Edmund had marked with an X. He said in a voice that was a thread, "He built this for you." And Clara, whose own eyes were wet, but who did not weep because weeping was not what was asked for in the moment, said, "He built the door for me. I built the rest." Harlon Croft smiled the small, slow smile of a man who was no longer building anything and was content not to be. And he closed his eyes and he said, in the last full sentence he ever said aloud, "That is the correction I needed to hear." He slept after that. He did not wake again. He went sometime between 3 and 4 in the morning on the 18th of December, in the warm air of the cave, with his wife on one side of him and Clara Vance on the other, and neither woman. When she told the story afterward, said she was sure of the exact minute, because the breath had gone, the way a wind goes gradually, and the moment when it had stopped was not a moment. It was a quiet. Clara Vance lived until 1923. She was 69 when she died in her own bed, in the expanded house that had grown up around the original mouth of the cave. The cave itself long since turned into the rear half of the dwelling. The bench refinished twice and still working. Eli was 43 and was a bridge engineer in Denver with 3 children of his own, and he came up for the funeral with all 3 children and a wife who had not known Clara as well as she had wanted to, but who had read twice the small self-published booklet that Claire had written in 1902 and had sold at the general store for 50 cents a booklet titled Plainly The Heating of a House in the Colorado High Country, and which was as of 1923 in its 4th printing. May was 41 and was the teacher at the Ironbell schoolhouse, which had been rebuilt in 1910 and heated unsurprisingly by a Vance hearth. And May had 3 children as well, and the oldest of them a girl of 10. Read at the funeral the line her grandmother had written in the back of her father's Cordovan journal. Because Clara had asked for that line to be read, and had asked for it to be read by a child. The line had not been written in the winter of 1888. Clara had held the pen that night, and she had put it down because the line she wanted had not yet come to her. She had kept the journal on the shelf in the cave for the rest of that winter, and through the spring, and she had taken it down once a week and had looked at the blank page under Edmund's line and had waited. The line had come to her on a morning in the summer of 1889, the 29th of July, a day that was warm and blue and full of the dry mountain smell of pine, and she had written it in pencil first, and then, when she was sure, in her own careful ink, and it had stayed on that page ever since. Edmund's line above it in the slightly larger hand he had used that one time. The earth does not forget the sun. And, beneath it in Clara's steadier, narrower hand, the line her granddaughter read in a voice that was clear and almost bored, in the way children's voices are bored when they are reading something that matters and do not yet know that it matters. And a mother learns to listen to the stories the earth has been telling all along. The granddaughter closed the journal. She sat down. The Reverend, who was not the Reverend of 1888, but his successor, said a short prayer. And then the people of Ironbell, which was by 1923 a larger town than it had been and was no longer a silver town, but a timber and cattle town, went out into the summer light. They went to Clara's house afterward, as people do after a funeral, and they sat in the parlor and on the bench in the rear half of the house that had once been the cave, and they drank coffee and ate cake and told stories. And one of the stories told that afternoon by a man of 60 who had been a boy of 6 in the winter of 1888, and who was the grandson of Silas Pemberton, was the story his grandfather had told him when he was 12. It was the story of the walk up the hill in the storm, with his sister wrapped in 3 quilts against his chest, and of the door opening in the drift, and of the warmth that was not a wall, but an arrival. The boy of 6, now a man of 60, had not been old enough to remember the walk himself. He remembered, he said, only the bench. He remembered, he said, the feeling of the warm clay under his back, and the feeling that he was not going to die, and he had not until he was a grown man with children of his own. Understood that those 2 feelings were the same feeling. He was quiet after he said it. The people in the parlor were quiet with him. May, who had been pouring coffee, set the pot down. Eli, who had been standing by the window, did not turn around at once. Outside, the light was the particular long golden light of late afternoon in the high country in July, and the smoke from the kitchen chimney of Clara's house rose into that light the way the smoke had risen on the morning of the first successful fire in October of 1888. Thin, clean, almost not there. A line of disturbance in the air that you had to be looking for to see. A train on the spur line down in the valley sounded its whistle once, a long soft note, and went on toward Gunnison. Eli turned from the window. He did not give a speech. He said only to the room in a voice that had his father's cadence in it. If you knew to listen. She told me once when I was a boy that my father had given her a door, and that she had built the rest. I asked her what she meant by the rest. She thought about it for a while. She said the rest is learning to live in what you have been given. That is all I remember her saying that afternoon. I have thought about it every winter since. He sat down on the bench. He put his palm flat on the clay. Beside him, which had been warmed that morning by the small fire his sister had laid at dawn, and he kept it there, and the people in the parlor went on with their quiet talking, and the warmth of the stone rose into his hand the way it had risen into his hand when he was 8 years old. On the first night the cave had become his home, and he understood as a man of 43 the thing he had not been able to understand as a boy, which was that the warmth in the stone beneath his palm was not heat. It was time. It was the long, slow, patient time that his mother had learned to keep from a husband who had loved her enough to leave her a map, and from a neighbor who had helped her carry stones she could not carry alone, and from a town that had been wrong about her and had been given the chance to become right, and from a man who had walked 200 yards in a blizzard, in order to be told at the far end of the walk by a woman on the floor of a cave that there was warm water in a cup, and bread on a bench, and room for him if he wanted it at the warm end. The cave held. The town held. The story held. In every winter after, for as long as there has been an Ironbell, Colorado, there has been on some hillside in that valley a small tight fire burning in a narrow throat at the back of a long curved bench, and a family sleeping in the quiet warmth of stone that has remembered once more the sun.